For this week's episode of Big Ideas with Ben Weingarten, in honor of Independence Day, we're going to do something a little bit different. Each year on July 4th, I read and reflect upon the Declaration of Independence as a reminder of the ideals, values, and principles that America strives for and which this great nation was built on. And I always find that as I'm going through these readings, there are certain passages that jump out. They are relevant, they are poignant. It is as if they could be written about things that are transpiring in America today, and I usually get quite animated as I read and reflect upon this with my family. My wife, who has witnessed my declaration animation, recommended that given this year, Independence Day, July 4th, falls on a Wednesday, the day we typically release each episode of this podcast, I should share some of my thoughts with you. So I'm going to do something of an exegesis of the Declaration, and that term, exegesis, is usually thrown around to describe the interpretation of a religious text. I think that's apt here, though, because there is a sacrosanct quality to our founding documents, and of course, not only was the founding of this nation in large part driven by a desire for religious liberty and freedom of conscience, but there are clear biblical parallels to what occurred with the great gift that we have in the founding of this nation. Calvin Coolidge, on the 150th anniversary of Independence Day, said something that really resonates in context of this message. He said, and I quote here, "In its main features, the Declaration of Independence is a great spiritual document. It is a declaration not of material, but of spiritual conceptions. Equality, liberty, popular sovereignty, the rights of man. These are not elements which we can see and touch. They are ideals. They have their source and their roots in the religious convictions. They belong to the unseen world. Unless the faith of the American people in these religious convictions is to endure, the principles of our declaration will perish. We cannot continue to enjoy the result if we neglect and abandon the cause." The founders themselves were, of course, not only deeply concerned with the fact that religion be protected in this country, but they believed that we needed a moral and virtuous people to sustain the system they were seeking to build. In any event, today I'm going to do a few things with this episode. First, I'm going to speak about the significance of the Declaration itself. Then I'm going to walk through some of the text and highlight some of the, again, amazing but often overlooked or taken for granted parts of the Declaration that are worthy of some attention and appreciation. And lastly, I'm going to point out where the Declaration is so relevant to today. I hope you'll follow along with me as we honor those who gave us this nation in remembering their work and their sacrifice. And if you like what you hear, that you'll share this episode with your family and friends and subscribe to the podcast, rate it and review it on iTunes or wherever else you're listening to us. Of course, you can find all our episodes on benweingarten.com/bigideas, and you can follow me on Twitter at BHWeingarten. Now, without further ado, let's talk about the Declaration of Independence. Why is it so critical that on today, July 4th, we stop and think about a document from 1776 that says we're going to break from England and a king, King George III, that's doing all these cruel things to our forefathers? Well, the Declaration is a radical document because it goes against the norm in history. When you read history, what you see is that the relationship everywhere when it comes to government is king and subject, czar and peasant, slave master and slave. It is always power from above, and you're given little tidbits of freedom, maybe, if you're lucky. But tyranny is what reigns in most places, and the rule of the strong is what reigns in most places. What the founders were aiming at was something quite revolutionary. Their idea was that every man is a sovereign, every man is a king. Decision-making isn't in the hands of the ruler, but the citizen who rules the ruler. He is himself the king. He's free to do as he wishes so long as his freedom does not violate the freedoms of others. So this concept of power to the people, not in the hands of a dictator, benevolent or not so benevolent, or an Ivy League technocrat, is progress in the eyes of the founders. Moving in the other direction, that is ceding our liberties to a ruler, however he may be, whether it's a body of government, whether it's one man, whether it's a million bureaucrats, is regressive, which is one of the reasons, incidentally, that I call progressivism regressive. And it bears noting that Woodrow Wilson, when he wrote about the Declaration of Independence, said you can ignore the preamble. The preamble, of course, where we talk about life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness and inalienable rights that government can't take away from us, which I'll get to in a second. So we have this idea in the Declaration of liberty triumphing over tyranny. And there's also a concept of consent of the governed versus the rule of the king. Again, this is just not the norm throughout history, nor was there a concept in most places, in most times, of legitimacy in government emanating from the consent of the people. This is really the difference in part between civilization and barbarism. In barbarism, in a state of nature, the strong dominate the weak. In civilization, every man is the strong man. And in fact, government is constrained by the citizenry and by the institutions that have been built through documents like, for example, the Constitution. So again, the Declaration is kind of the great exception throughout history. Abraham Lincoln, when he described the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, did so with a biblical allusion. He said that the Declaration was the quote-unquote apple of gold, and the Constitution is the quote-unquote frame of silver around it. Here's the full statement. He said, and I quote, "The assertion of that principle at that time was the word fitly spoken, which has proved an apple of gold to us." He's referring there to the Declaration. "The Union and the Constitution are the picture of silver, subsequently framed around it. The picture was made not to conceal or destroy the apple, but to adorn and preserve it. The picture was made for the apple, not the apple for the picture." Here's how I've always thought about it, and I think it dovetails well with what Abraham Lincoln said. The Declaration is sort of the spirit of America. The Constitution is the letter. The Declaration is our national soul. It's the animating force behind this nation. The Constitution is the body or the structure or the framework that helps enable our flourishing. It helps enable us to pursue our happiness. But again, the Declaration is the spirit. And I would suggest that you can't read the Constitution without the Declaration. The Constitution without that spirit, yes, it provides a structure and a framework, but it all falls if the people don't believe in the values and principles that are actually at its core, at its root. So the Declaration lists all these things King George III did that violated the rights of the people, and it bears noting that the Constitution itself is largely about what the government cannot do to you. It's a charter of negative liberties, and you can sort of tie in all of the offenses that Thomas Jefferson and his co-authors wrote in the Declaration about the king doing this, this, and this, with the actual negative liberties reflected in the Constitution, which say the government cannot do X, Y, and Z to you. So again, it's not about what government does for you, but about protecting you from a government that would do things on your behalf and to you against your will and in violation of your rights. So there's a parallel, a direct parallel, between the charges laid out in the Declaration of Independence and the negative liberties that are granted towards government in the Constitution. Again, the one point I would go back to before we jump into the text is that the Declaration was an anti-tyranny document, just as the Constitution is an anti-tyranny document. The Constitution is concerned with securing the consent of the people through representative government in a republican framework, and that's how the government has its legitimacy. But it's also about putting a check on the concentration of powers in any one body or one man. That is the definition of tyranny. And that's why we have checks and balances and separation of powers in the three branches of government, and that's why we have federalism, or at least what's left of it. It's checked at any of a number of different levels, both internally and beyond. And of course, the ultimate check is the people. This is why the founders in the Federalist Papers also talked about the need for ambition to counteract ambition. They knew the nature of man. They said men are not angels. If men were angels, we wouldn't need to have this sort of governmental structure. And also that you can't constrain ambition. The idea wasn't to control ambition or to control factions, but to allow ambitions and factions to proliferate, thus checking all interests against each other. So there was a certain gridlock built into our system, precisely so that it was very hard for there to be radical changes depending on how the political winds were blowing. This system of all these competing forces also protected the rights of the minority, which they were very concerned about, the tyranny of the mob, the tyranny of the majority, squelching the minority. And the smallest minority to be protected, of course, was the individual. The Declaration, of course, is concerned about all the problems that occur in a system in which powers accumulate in any one branch or one individual, in which there is no representation or no protection of rights. And so you can see that the Declaration and the Constitution parallel each other, and the things that they were trying to prevent against in the form of tyranny dovetail again quite well. So let's jump into the text here. The preamble, of course, begins, when in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle them, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation. We hold these truths to be self-evident. That all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. I want to unpack a couple pieces of this here. First is the allusion to the law of nature and of nature's God. I'd suggest, when is the last time that you heard a politician talk about rights as coming from nature and nature's God? Rights are always talked about today as if they are granted to you by government, but it's actually the exact opposite. As they say here, you are born with unalienable rights, rights that cannot be taken away from you, granted to you by nature, and that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And since you're born with these rights, you also have a right to self-government, to your liberty, to equality in terms of opportunity, not equality in terms of your condition, but equality in terms of your rights and also your responsibilities. But that concept of nature and nature's God suggests that there are laws that can be intuited by reason and or faith. And that's something that's not talked about today, with the exception of a couple Supreme Court justices, namely Justice Clarence Thomas. Rights weren't about a right to health care, a right to education, a right to college, a right to a car. No. What you had was equal rights in your liberty and your ability to be protected from tyranny. And you give up some of those rights and you consent to be governed in order to secure the fundamental rights. In the next passage, the founders talk about prudence. They say, prudence indeed will dictate that governments long established should not be changed for light and transient causes. And accordingly, all experience hath shown that mankind are more disposed to suffer while evils are sufferable than to right themselves by abolishing the forms to which they are accustomed. But when a long train of abuses and usurpations, pursuing invariably the same object, evinces a design to reduce them under absolute despotism, it is their right, it is their duty to throw off such government and to provide new guards for their future security. I think it's important here to note that there's the concept of prudence. Prudence is not a word that our leaders, any leaders, frequently use today. It suggests, this passage, that you don't just throw away an existing system unless that system becomes destructive of its own ends. I would say that progressives would suggest it's no big deal for the Supreme Court to make up a few rights here or there, or rationales, or tests that they used to justify their judgments without any basis of law or its historical origins or the natural rights foundation that the founders spoke to. They would suggest that new rights can be invented out of thin air if society has advanced far enough in the quote-unquote arc of history. Again, prudence suggests, though, that it's better to live with warts in our system and to convince and persuade people through a legislative branch than to fundamentally transform the system into something that, again, in the founders' words, reduces that system under absolute despotism. I want to return a second to the idea of natural rights and nature's God. And the founders, again, link faith to natural rights and freedom. There's some quotes here not frequently spoken about, often I think because there's an attempt today to try to divorce our founding from kind of the religious nature of why the country was created and then the Judeo-Christian principles that underscore the system on which we were built. And I think this is important regardless of what your views are about traditional religions, that you understand where the founders were coming from here. So again, the founders link faith to natural rights and to freedom. John Adams, writing in 1772, he says, and I quote, "If men through fear, fraud, or mistake should in terms renounce and give up any essential natural right, the eternal law of reason and the great end of society would absolutely vacate such renunciation. The right to freedom being the gift of God Almighty, it is not in the power of man to alienate this gift and voluntarily become a slave." Alexander Hamilton, writing in 1775, and I quote here, "The sacred rights of mankind are not to be rummaged for among old parchments or musty records. They are written, as with a sunbeam, in the whole volume of human nature, by the hand of the divinity itself, and can never be erased or obscured by mortal power." George Washington, in his farewell address, I think says something that is also incredibly important. He writes, and I quote, "Of all the dispositions and habits which lead to political prosperity, religion and morality are indispensable supports. In vain would that man claim the tribute of patriotism, who should labor to subvert these great pillars of human happiness, these firmest props of the duties of men and citizens. Whatever may be conceded to the influence of refined education on minds of peculiar structure, reason, and experience both forbid us to expect that national morality can prevail in exclusion of religious principle. It is substantially true that virtue or morality is a necessary spring of popular government." I bring up these quotes as a way of getting to the fact that the founders were intently concerned with the fact that you needed a virtuous people to sustain this system they were advocating for, and that it was virtue and morality that would ensure that there would be liberty, that our rights would be protected. And that's something to consider when you think about what's occurred in our society today, where you've seen a breakdown in many ways of what have been considered for thousands of years the code by which to live by: manners, decorum, right and wrong, respecting others. All of these things in many ways are lacking today, and the founders would have been, I think, aghast at what has occurred, but also most afraid from the perspective of the fact that you need a virtuous people to sustain the system that they built. So this isn't a way of moralizing, but it is a way of bringing up what the founders were concerned with in context of their Declaration of Independence. So now we move forward to all of the ills of the king, his abuse and harassment of the colonists, and why they felt justified in untethering themselves from his kingdom. What the king does can be analogized to what an out-of-control president or an out-of-control judiciary, or even between an out-of-control federal government versus a state government, which is that powers were concentrated in the Revolutionary era in the king and taken from the people and their representatives. But that concept of tyranny, in which the consent of the governed is abrogated and power is held in any one entity, is what the founders were concerned with, and so it's relevant beyond just the abuses of the king, because the abuses of the king can be the abuses of any of a number of other branches of government or individuals at any time. Here is one of the items in the list of horribles where the founders lay out all the abuses that gets me every time. The line is, he being the king, has erected a multitude of new offices and sent hither swarms of officers to harass our people and eat out their substance. To me, what this line describes is exactly our modern administrative state, the sprawling bureaucracy that's been built in our government, where the legislative branch has delegated its lawmaking powers to a seemingly infinite number of alphabet soup agencies consisting of well over 1 million people, almost 2 million people, and if you count the Department of Defense, well over 2 million people as well. And these agencies regulate every aspect of our life. They are funded by us. Usually they exist under the guise of protecting us, but frequently we find that they exist essentially to perpetuate and insulate themselves and accumulate increasing power, usually to protect some interest that a politician wants, or to allow a politician to essentially be derelict in his duties. He should be representing us and legislating. It shouldn't be delegated to some far-off, unelected bureaucrat who makes decisions over our lives and, oh, by the way, in many cases gets a ridiculously large salary, as I'll speak to in just a second. So when I look at this line, he has erected a multitude of new offices and sent hither swarms of officers to harass our people and eat out their substance. To me, this is the swamp. Harry Truman had a funny line about this. And this is back, again, we're talking in the 40s and 50s, so well before the massive explosion of our federal bureaucracy. He said, quote, "I thought I was the president, but when it comes to these bureaucrats, I can't do a damn thing." That says something when a president has no control over people who are theoretically his subordinates in the executive branch. Gary Lawson, who's a professor at Boston University Law School, described this, I think, in perhaps the best way. He captures this idea of tyranny of bureaucracy. He says, and I quote, "Consider the typical enforcement activities of a typical federal agency, for example, of the Federal Trade Commission. The Commission promulgates substantive rules of conduct. The Commission then considers whether to authorize investigations into whether the Commission's rules have been violated. If the Commission authorizes an investigation, the investigation is conducted by the Commission, which reports its findings to the Commission. If the Commission thinks that the Commission's findings warrant an enforcement action, the Commission issues a complaint. The Commission's complaint that a Commission rule has been violated is then prosecuted by the Commission and adjudicated by the Commission. This Commission adjudication can either take place before the full Commission or before a semi-autonomous Commission administrative law judge. If the Commission chooses to adjudicate before an administrative law judge rather than before the Commission, and the decision is adverse to the Commission can appeal to the Commission. If the Commission ultimately finds a violation, then and only then, the affected private party can appeal to an Article III court. But the agency decision, even before the bona fide Article III tribunal, possesses a very strong presumption of correctness on matters of both fact and of law." This is the definition of tyranny. It is the accumulation of the legislative, executive, and judicial branches all in one in an executive agency. Unelected, unresponsible, never has to answer to the citizens it supposedly represents. And again, there's also the idea that Congress should not be able to delegate its powers to an executive agency like this. But here you have it. Here you have the definition of tyranny. Let's talk a little about the size and scope of the swamp, the administrative state. Each year, the Competitive Enterprise Institute puts out its annual 10,000 Commandments. Let me reveal some of the findings from their most recent version, and this is based on 2017 numbers. Federal regulations in 2017 cost Americans $1.9 trillion. Let's put a number that's too big to comprehend in a little bit of perspective. $1.9 trillion is more than all the personal and corporate income tax the IRS collected last year. The value of U.S. federal regulations, that $1.9 trillion, would in and of itself rank as the 8th largest economy in the world, ahead of Italy. Every single household in America owes almost $15,000 if you were to look at the hidden cost of these regulations worth $1.9 trillion. Another number that kind of puts into perspective a harassing government. The 2017 Federal Register, which contains all the federal government rules, was 61,308 pages last year, and that's a 36% decline from where the Federal Register was in 2016. So we've made progress down to over 61,000 pages of federal rules, many of which you violate on a daily basis. There's a book out there, of course, which talks about 3 crimes that we commit a day that we don't even know of because of this just massive, convoluted bureaucracy that's been built. And also, just to talk a little bit about the rules, Congress enacted 97 laws in 2017. Federal agencies issued 3,281 rules, so 34 rules for every law created. So what does the law mean when there are 34 rules that actually dictate what the law means? That means your legislator isn't making the law, the bureaucrat's making the law. And then what does our government do with the money that we cede to it every year? And talk about taxation without representation here, which of course is another charge, an essential charge against the king. Well, last year there was $1.7 million, and this is according to the 2017 government waste book, which is put out every year. $1.7 million for a comedy club starring holograms of dead comedians. $1.5 million from our government to test the endurance of a fish on a treadmill. I'm not making this up. This is literally what our government spends our hard-earned money on, and then the money of our future generations based upon the debt that's accumulated to finance all this stuff. $817,000 to study monkey drool. $3.4 million for hamster cage fight matches. $450,000 to determine if dinosaurs could sing. We are living the onion. Another way to look at this concept of the federal government eating out the substance of the people, as the Declaration says, is a report that was put out by Open the Books in late 2017. So the federal government pays its disclosed workforce. So there are, of course, people that are off the book. The government hides sort of the information about them under grounds, generally of national security, but also on some less justifiable grounds. 1.97 million employees in executive agencies and the U.S. Post Office who were paid $136 billion in cash compensation, or $1 million per minute, or $524 million per day. About 1 in 5 federal employees makes a 6-figure salary. There are 78 agencies where the average salary is $100,000 or more. Federal employees also probably get better benefits than you. Federal employees get 10 federal holidays, 13 sick days, and 20 vacation days per year. Private sector American workers get 10 days PTO per year on average. Here's another way to look at what the government does relative to what was described in the Declaration of Independence. There are 35,000 lawyers in the administrative state, but only 1/3 actually work in the Department of Justice. So what are these people doing? Well, likely harassing you. Maybe the EPA wants to come after you because in your backyard, there's a puddle that they classify as wetlands. Actually, the EPA itself has spent over $715 million on its criminal enforcement division. Did you know that the EPA has a criminal enforcement division? That division has paid for, among other things, 200 special agents armed with guns, ammunition, and other military-grade equipment. Another fact, there are more than 3,600 public affairs and marketing employees in 70 federal departments and independent agencies, making an aggregate $368 million per year. So your tax dollars are going to fund advertising for these agencies, which then waste your tax dollars and pay themselves lavish salaries. Now again, these hordes of federal agents can harass you if you have a puddle in your backyard. If you're a conservative, the IRS can come after you because you have a political advocacy group that you want to establish. They might raid your company if you're like Gibson Guitar, perhaps use the wrong type of wood, or maybe just get on the wrong side of the administration and office. And this isn't even going into all of the issues and we've talked about some of these in other episodes, dealing with mass surveillance and data collection and the potential for abuse there. So let's move to another line now. He has refused his assent to laws the most wholesome and necessary for the public good. So King George III vetoed a bunch of laws that were passed in the colonies. And one can think of this as a central government, in this case in the form of a king, subverting the liberty of the states. So we have a federalist system where power that is not granted to the federal government resides with the states or the people, and the powers that are granted to the federal government are few and narrowly defined, regardless of how they've been interpreted. Most of the power resides with the states and with us, but increasingly we're going the way of the colonists, and we're seeing a federal government that has all the power, which mandates things of the states and violates what people in the states actually want in many cases. And the states are less and less laboratories of experiment and more irrelevant in the face of a dominant federal power. Another charge against the king. He has refused to pass other laws for the accommodation of large districts of people unless those people would relinquish the right of representation in the legislature, a right inestimable to them and formidable to tyrants only. So if government closest to the people is best, then the more it gets centralized and further away from them, like in Washington, D.C., let's say, the more the power of the people over their system diminishes. In a similar way here, representation was granted only by the king, not through the consent of the governed by way of their representatives. So you see here an accumulation of power in a central body, which means less power closer to the people, where they can keep a watchful eye over it and ensure that their consent is being met with the decisions that their representatives are making. Another charge. He has obstructed the administration of justice by refusing his assent to laws for establishing judiciary powers. I'd say, interestingly, today we're seeing the reverse. Over the last couple years, for example, there have been over 20 nationwide injunctions, and I wrote about this in a recent piece at The Federalist that I urge you to check out, whereby any one of some 600 federal judges can block a lawful action by the executive branch nationwide. So they can file a universal injunction where a random judge, federal judge, for example, in Hawaii, can stop an executive branch action from taking place over an entire country. One judge in one jurisdiction dealing with one set of plaintiffs can stop the government from acting everywhere. The federal judiciary has more power than the executive when it wants to. So in this case, again, you have a judiciary refusing to assent to the executive, but it's the same sort of principle. With the king, we had an obstruction of administration of justice by refusing to deal with the judiciary, and in the opposite case today, we have a judiciary that refuses the execution of law by the executive. Another charge. He has combined with others to subject us to a jurisdiction foreign to our Constitution and unacknowledged by our laws, giving his assent to their acts of pretended legislation. Well, the U.S., under certain administrations, has tried to subject itself to international institutions and international law forums that are often antithetical to or in violation of our laws and rights, for example, even laid out in the Bill of Rights, in particular when it comes to the Second Amendment. The line, of course, for imposing on us taxes without our consent. Well, no taxation without representation describes almost all of our tax code, okay? Basically, we fund any of a million different interests, which are in the interest of the politicians, not necessarily in our interest. And many of the things that each of us fund, I am sure, would violate our conscience and are against what we believe the purpose of government should and ought to be in defending us against adversaries, foreign and domestic, and executing upon a small range of, again, narrowly defined powers, limited powers, with the rest of that freedom with us. It's held with us. We only give up a little bit of it. Another charge against the king. He has abdicated government here by declaring us out of his protection and waging war against us. Well, this sounds an awful lot like sanctuary cities. In a sanctuary city, you have authorities that won't help protect citizens against non-citizens and cooperating with federal authorities when it comes to deportation. And in some cases, like in Oakland, for example, you even have government officials giving warning to criminal illegal aliens in advance of immigration enforcement authorities coming to do their job and remove dangerous people who are here illegally from our shores. Another charge against the king. He has excited domestic insurrection among us and has endeavored to bring on the inhabitants of our frontiers, the merciless Indian savages whose known rule of warfare is an undistinguished destruction of all ages, sexes, and conditions. I want to focus on that excited domestic insurrection among us. We could focus, for example, on politicians today who have sought to whip up, in some sense, domestic insurrection. I'm thinking here in particular about whipping up Occupy Wall Street or Antifa, who use violence instead of words and reason to try to advocate for their points and shut down anyone else who might deign to hold a competing viewpoint. And we can also talk about those who are now actively calling for an end to border enforcement. If we don't have immigration enforcement, you don't have national sovereignty, you really don't have a nation. There is, in some sense, inciting a domestic insurrection when you leave your borders wide open to any and all who wish to come in. That's lawlessness. But I want to address one thing that you might not have known about this passage. And we haven't really spoken about the issue of slavery yet, but the issue of slavery often overshadows the Declaration of Independence because there's an argument that the founders were hypocrites. They lay out this document of liberties and equal rights for all, and then they allowed this horrible institution to perpetuate itself for some time until we in part fought a war over it and ended the issue mercifully. In this last line about domestic insurrection, Thomas Jefferson, in an original draft of the Declaration, sought to address slavery. And here was the passage that he wrote that was ultimately stricken by some of the others who were reviewing the document. And I'll quote here. He being the king, has waged cruel war against human nature itself, violating its most sacred rights of life and liberty in the persons of a distant people who never offended him, captivating and carrying them into slavery in another hemisphere, or to incur miserable death in their transportation thither. This piratical warfare, the opprobrium of infidel powers, is the warfare of the Christian king of Great Britain. Determined to keep open a market where men should be bought and sold, he has prostituted his negative for suppressing every legislative attempt to prohibit or to restrain this execrable commerce, and that this assemblage of horrors might want no fact of distinguished dye, he is now exciting those very people to rise in arms among us and to purchase that liberty of which he has deprived them by murdering the people upon whom he also obtruded them, thus paying off former crimes committed against the liberties of one people with crimes which he urges them to commit against the lives of another. This line from Jefferson is not often spoken about, and Jefferson is probably held up as the chief hypocrite among the Founding Fathers because he, of course, was a large slaveholder. But in his private writings and in what he wanted to put in publicly in the Declaration of Independence, he opposed the institution, and he, like many of the founders, blamed King George III for introducing it into America from the start. And I think what you can see is a constant battle between the acknowledgement and the recognition of the founders that this is an abominable institution that has no basis in the very values and principles that they put forth. And sadly, all too sadly, from a practical perspective, to keep the country together, they recognized that they couldn't abolish the institution at the start, but they created the conditions that would ultimately enable it to fall. And you can say that they failed in this endeavor because they were responsible for allowing the institution to perpetuate itself. But I do think it's important to note what they themselves said and wrote about slavery and the measures that they took to allow it to eventually be eviscerated and for our nation to actually live up to the principles that they set forth in the Declaration and the Constitution. So here's what George Washington said about the institution, which he felt was abhorrent. Quote, "There's not a man living who wishes more sincerely than I do to see a plan adopted for the abolition of it." John Adams, "Every measure of prudence, therefore, ought to be assumed for the eventual total extirpation of slavery from the United States. I have through my whole life held the practice of slavery in abhorrence." Benjamin Franklin, "Slavery is an atrocious debasement of human nature." Alexander Hamilton, "The laws of certain states give an ownership in the service of slaves as personal property, but being men by the laws of God and nature, they were capable of acquiring liberty, and when the captor in war thought fit to give them liberty, the gift was not only valid, but irrevocable." James Madison, "We have seen the mere distinction of color made in the most enlightened period of time a ground of the most oppressive dominion ever exercised by man over man." The founders, of course, sought to take measures to slowly but surely push out this institution. So the Three-Fifths Compromise, for example, is always talked about as a means of devaluing slaves as if they are not human beings. That's how it's taught in many of the history books. Actually, the Three-Fifths Compromise was all about diminishing the power of the slave-holding South. The idea was that the slave masters would make their slaves vote just like the slave masters did, and if a slave counted as one full vote, the South would have disproportionate power relative to the North, and the slave-holding South thus would have disproportionate power. Also, in the Constitution, the importation of slaves was guaranteed to persist for 20 years following the signing of the Constitution, which was another horrible compromise made with the South. President Jefferson signed into a law a federal prohibition of the slave trade the day the provision no longer prevailed on January 1, 1808, so 20 years. Abraham Lincoln himself, who of course dealt with slavery in as pragmatic a fashion as he can, trying to keep the Union together, also advocating against the institution, but not trying to upset the apple cart too much, and ultimately still had a civil war, in part over the issue. He said that for the founders, the argument of necessity was the only argument they ever admitted in favor of slavery. There's a line from Lincoln where he writes, and I quote, "The plain, unmistakable spirit of that age toward slavery was hostility to the principle and toleration only by necessity." And in context of the Declaration and the Constitution that in some respects stems from it, what Frederick Douglass wrote, I think, is quite instructive. He called the charge of the Constitution being a pro-slavery document a, quote, slander upon the memory of the founders. He wrote that, interpreted as it ought to be interpreted, the Constitution is a glorious liberty document. The Constitution, according to its plain reading, and I defy the presentation of a single pro-slavery clause in it. On the other hand, it will be found to contain principles and purposes entirely hostile to the existence of slavery. And Douglass also writes about the Declaration and slavery when it came to the Dred Scott decision. So here's Frederick Douglass writing in 1857. "I base my sense of the certain overthrow of slavery in part upon the nature of the American government, the Constitution, the tendencies of the age, and the character of the American people. I know of no soil better adapted to the growth of reform than American soil. I know of no country where the conditions for effecting great changes in the settled order of things, for the development of right ideas of liberty and humanity, are more favorable than here in these United States. The Constitution, as well as the Declaration of Independence, and the sentiments of the founders of the Republic give us a platform broad enough and strong enough to support the most comprehensive plans for the freedom and elevation of all the people of this country without regard to color, class, or clime." I think what Frederick Douglass said is really crucial here, and that is that we have the means to overcome any and all number of injustices and ultimately to overcome tyranny. Slavery is tyranny, and tyranny is also the concentration of all powers in any one man or any one branch. And what the Declaration does is it is a guide to liberty. It advocates for liberty, and it informs a constitution that was expressly created to ensure that those rights were protected and our liberties were protected. So it is, of course, essential to remember the errors, grave errors that were made in history, but it is also essential to remember what the ideals that the founders strove for and that we should strive for are, and that is liberty for all and also special privileges for none. The Declaration continues, "In every stage of these oppressions, we've petitioned for redress in the most humble terms. Our repeated petitions have been answered only by repeated injury." And it continues, "Nor have we been wanting in our attentions to our British brethren. We have warned them from time to time of attempts by their legislator to extend an unwarrantable jurisdiction over us. We've reminded them of the circumstances of our immigration and settlement here." And basically they go on to talk about how the colonists have pleaded for representation, for the same freedoms as their British brethren, and they didn't get it. They never got it, and their calls for freedom were only met with further abuse, and thus they are justified in trying to make a break. Towards the end of the Declaration, I also think it's instructive to note this line. The colonists call for free and independent states, and they say, as free and independent states, they, the colonists, have full power to levy war, conclude peace, contract alliances, establish commerce, and do all other acts and things which independent states may have right do. Note here how limited those aims are. Levy war, conclude peace, contract alliances, establish commerce, do all other acts and things which independent states may of right do. That is essentially what the federal government is limited to in our Constitution. It didn't say that the government is involved in providing an infinite number of goods and services and employing around 2 million people and paying out billions and billions of dollars, if not trillions of dollars every year for all manner of things that have no basis in the natural laws and the liberties that the founders were trying to protect. So I'll close here by saying that every year that the government grows, I would suggest that our independence, our liberty contracts. And it's important to remember each year what this country was created to overthrow so that we don't slide towards tyranny of any kind again. This is why we have to cherish what the founders did. We have to appreciate how exceptional this nation was that they lay it out in these founding documents and do everything that we can to protect and preserve and cherish these amazingly unique and exceptional principles. John Adams wrote to Abigail Adams on July 3rd, 1776, "I am apt to believe that Independence Day, will be celebrated by succeeding generations as the great anniversary festival. It ought to be commemorated as the day of deliverance by solemn acts of devotion to God Almighty. It ought to be solemnized with pomp and parade, with shows, games, sports, guns, bells, bonfires, and illuminations from one end of this continent to the other, from this time forward forevermore." How prescient Adams was. I hope that as you enjoy your July 4th festivities with pomp and parade, bountiful barbecues in the company of friends and family, that you'll reflect on how lucky we all are, not because of these material comforts, but because of the liberty that has enabled us to build this nation and reap these fruits, and most of all, to pursue our happiness and to self-actualize, to fulfill our purpose on earth. The greatness in America is a byproduct of a system devoted to protecting our life and liberty, and again, enabling us to pursue this happiness, to pursue our dreams, to be our true selves, live in freedom. In my view, in addition to celebrating, we're duty-bound to honor the founders by reading and thinking about the Declaration of Independence each July 4th. We all ought to relish the fact that they bequeathed us this exceptional because of the values and principles it was built on, and exceptional in terms of its uniqueness as a beacon of freedom that is so rare in human history. Thank you for listening, and may God bless you, your family, and the United States of America. If you enjoyed this episode of Big Ideas with Ben Weingarten, please do subscribe to, rate, and review the program in the iTunes Store or wherever else you're listening to us. I'm your host, Ben Weingarten. For more episodes, visit my website at benweingarten.com/bigideas or follow me on Twitter at bhweingarten. Thanks for joining us, and we hope you'll listen in next time.